Thanks, Amy. I am very happy to be here. When Amy asked me to speak, I had to say no at first because at the time I was off work on disability leave, recovering from a head injury. Usually I give conference talks about whatever software I've been working on this year, but 2012 for me has mostly been about trying to understand how brains work. My own, as I recovered from this head injury, but also in the bigger picture, understanding what neuroscience is telling us about how people process information, answer questions, and make choices, and how we might apply that in libraries. There's an exercise that I've encountered a few times, first in library school and later in management retreats in similar situations, where you try to get at the root of what motivates someone. You keep asking why until you get to a primary motivation. When I was in library school, we were all encouraged to try this in order to figure out why we wanted to be librarians. And it usually came down to something like, I feel good when I help people. Generally, we are all doing the things we do because they feel good to us on some level. We're getting some reward for that activity, and that reward at its most basic level happens in the form of neurotransmitters. So there's this concept of flow, and positive psychology tells us that engaging in flow is the biggest predictor of health and happiness and all good things that we all want. And you get flow when you engage in an activity that is intrinsically motivated. You're not looking for some outside reward. The activity you're engaging in is the reward. Those of us who are very lucky are able to find paying jobs that sometimes involve flow activities for us. When I'm really in the zone, writing software can be a flow activity for me. But other days, when I'm slogging through something, it's that paycheck that keeps me going. And I believe that most library users are the same way. Of course, we'll always need to serve folks who are slogging through a paper that they don't really want to write. But I'd like to spend some time thinking about how we might enable as much flow in the library as possible. I want to figure out how to make our collections genuinely pleasurable to use. Now, this shouldn't be hard. I know there's a lot of public library people, but I work in an academic library, so I'm mostly going to focus on academics. Academics are the most autotelic people I know. This shines through when you really engage someone in conversation about their research topic. I've worked with a lot of faculty members and PhD students over the years, and not a single one of them was in it for the money. The people we serve care about their research, and they care about library collections and archival collections and museum collections. I find my work as rewarding as I do because I care about those collections too. We are all otaku, as Aaron Cope reminded us on Friday. But I've got this nagging feeling that something important is missing from the online access we provide to those collections, and this talk is my current thinking about what that might be. I first got suspicious that something important was missing when I conducted interviews for a research study about how graduate students in the humanities and social sciences were using the library back at the University of Alberta. One thing that really stuck out to me as I conducted the interviews, and later as I coded the transcripts, was first how important browsing was to them. And second, the language that these students would use to describe physical browsing versus online access to the same content. When describing physical browsing, people used emotional words. They felt joy when they encountered that serendipitous find in the stacks. They felt tranquility when they browsed the new bookshelf in the reading room. One sociology PhD student described to me in loving detail her favorite place to study in the library. She described the lighting, the smell, the quiet, the beauty of her surroundings, the pleasure she felt at running her fingers over shelves of books on her favorite subject. Another student told me, with clear distress and frustration, that he used to spend every lunch hour in the new journals room, happily browsing, but now felt at a loss because the library had canceled their print subscriptions and he had to rely on online access. If he knew what he was looking for already, he said, online access was very fast and efficient in getting it. And there were times when he really appreciated that. But he also felt he had been robbed of a great pleasure, and one of the ways he felt most comfortable staying current with research in his field. Around the time I was conducting that study, Stanford University was asking similar questions of its faculty members. For various reasons, Stanford had decided to close certain on-campus physical libraries and move those collections off campus, and a group of faculty members were asked to respond to this. Here's what they said verbatim from the report. First, browsing is very important to them too. The single most repeated comment we received from faculty across the university, not just among humanities people, not just among social scientists, was the importance of browsing to their research and their concern for its survival. And further, they let us know exactly what they mean by browsing. Browsing is a spatial practice within a physical domain described by an immediate research question. It is a process of discovery intimately shaped by the structures of a vertically integrated library. At once human in scale, a reader's body moves physically through the library, and psychologically satisfying for its moments of insight. Libraries of the future, whatever technologies they embody, should be mindful of this tradition and be designed to enhance the benefits of browsing, not render it obsolete. I would really like to figure out how to do that. So why is browsing so important? I think it helps to understand a bit about how our brains process information. This is Jill Taylor. When part of the brain is suppressed, like when it's damaged, it allows different parts of the brain to become dominant. Jill Taylor is a neuroanatomist who suffered a stroke in the left side of her brain, and she's written a fascinating and illuminating description of her stroke and her recovery in the book, My Stroke of Insight. If you don't read the book, at least watch her TED Talk. It's really good. Because the left side of her brain was damaged, she has a lot to tell us about what the right side of our brains do when left to their own devices. And here's what she says. As the dominating fibers of my left hemisphere shut down, they no longer inhibited the right hemisphere, and my perception was free to shift, such that my consciousness could embody the tranquility of my right mind. In the absence of my left hemisphere's analytical judgment, I was completely entranced by the feelings of tranquility, safety, blessedness, euphoria, and omniscience. And these are the kinds of words that people are using when they're describing the physical collections. I just think that's really interesting. So I know she's having a stroke. This is not anything any one of us want to go through. But doesn't that sound kind of great? When you hear that, don't you want to learn how to tap into your right brain more, preferably without brain damage? She explains that our right brain sees how things are intuitively related, while the left brain sees how things are categorically different. When her usually dominant left brain was injured, she became much more able to see relatedness between things. Here's another direct quote. She says her consciousness soared into an all-knowingness, a being at one with the universe. That sense of tranquility, safety, blessedness, euphoria, and omniscience, that's inside all of us all of the time. But most of us are left brain dominant, so we don't get to experience our right brain consciousness very often, which is a shame because it's very powerful. And here's something interesting. Your right brain not only makes you happy, it makes you smarter. Daniel Kahneman, who's an economist, not a neuroanatomist, describes the brain in terms of how people make decisions. He shies away from the right brain, left brain terminology and instead uses the term system 1 and system 2. So system 1 is a fast, instinctive, emotional, and subconscious cognition system. System 2 thinking, on the other hand, is slow, logical, and under our conscious control. It's more predictable, but it takes a lot of effort. Have you ever noticed that we tend to see faces everywhere we look? We have a powerful System 1 algorithm for facial recognition, and it kicks in without our conscious minds deciding to recognize a face. It just happens. So when you see a parking meter and it looks like a face, that's because your System 1 facial recognition system is so fast, it's already happened before your conscious brain has a chance to catch up. It can trick us, and much of this book, Thinking Fast and Slow, is about irrational decisions people make because their System 1 is being fooled. But System 1 is also an immensely powerful part of our ability to think. Another way of saying that someone is expert in an area would be to say that their System 1 runs that particular bit of software. Another way of describing why we practice a musical instrument or a tennis serve would be to say that it needs to transfer from our System 2, where it is slow, effortful, and conscious, to our System 1, where it is fast, effortless, and unconscious. I also think of System 1 as the big guns. A lot of our long-term problem solving, the really difficult stuff that takes years, that takes a long time to sort through, the kind of problem that we gnaw out for weeks or months or years is constantly running as a background process in our brains. Have you ever been stuck on a problem and then you sleep on it or take a walk, and when you come back to it, the answer seems obvious? You just did some background processing. I suspect, but now I'm on shakier grounds in terms of what I have evidence for, that this is what we're observing in the phenomenon of serendipity. Something in you that is not conscious feels drawn to a certain book or article, and lo and behold, it turns out to be exactly what you needed, but did not consciously know you were looking for. System 1 is also where our emotions come from, and we are just starting to realize how vital they are in our ability to make decisions and solve problems. If you want to learn more about how our emotions affect our cognition, I highly recommend the book Emotional Design by Donald Norman. The crux of this book is that emotions change the way the human mind solves problems. Emotions influence how we think and how we choose, even for decisions that don't seem particularly emotional. Emotions, we now know, change the way the human mind solves problems. The emotional system changes how the cognitive system operates. When we are experiencing positive emotions, it's easy for us to engage our associative memory and to see the interconnectedness between things. On the other hand, when we are experiencing negative emotions, such as stress or frustration, which no one ever experiences when they're using their library catalog, we shut down our peripheral vision, so to speak. We focus on the task in front of us and on our preconceived ideas of what the answer is. This narrow view of what answers might be possible is not a path toward creative problem solving. Kim Martin told us on Friday that a prepared mind is a prerequisite for serendipity. I think part of that preparedness must be emotional state. If you're in a frustrated, goal-driven state, you won't be able to recognize the opportunity that on another day might have been a flash of insight. Indeed, without our emotions, we become completely unable to solve even very simple problems. Most people, if asked to imagine someone totally cut off from their emotional system, might picture someone like Spock, coolly logical, untroubled by any inner conflict. But in fact, people cut off from their emotions, say through brain damage, become cognitively impaired, unable to function, paralyzed over minor trivial choices. Not only does emotion make you smart, as Donald Norman puts it so succinctly, we cannot function without it. So what does all of this mean for library discovery? What would library discovery look like if we adopted some principles from emotional design? I would like us to consider the idea that the emotional side of design may be more critical to a product's success than its practical elements. I would like us to consider the idea that we perform a significant portion of our thinking and problem solving with our bodies and with our senses. We choose where to go next by following our gut instinct. We remember where we found information by using our spatial senses. And at this point, I think it's worth repeating what those Stanford professors are telling us about when they want about what they want from a browsing experience. They're telling us the same thing. Browsing is a spatial practice within a physical domain. It is a process of discovery, at once human in scale, a reader's body moves physically through the library, and psychologically satisfying for its moments of insight. So what might these libraries of the future look like? Let me start with a few things that I think we're doing right in the present moment, and then I'll move on to where I think this might take us in the future. We're making great progress on the problem of replicating and even improving shelf browsing in the virtual environment. Many library discovery systems have shelf browsing now to some degree. This is what some of my colleagues at Stanford have implemented for our blacklight interface, and it's been very popular and well received. This is the detailed view of a book in SearchWorks, our main discovery interface. You can see over on the left that you get a quick glance at what would be on either side of this book on the shelf. And if you click the Show Full Page link, you get an expanded view, a virtual shelf list with your current item in the center. You can immediately see some ways we have enhanced the benefits of browsing. We're seeing a virtual shelf list that spans physical collections. So even though the book we started with was in Green Library, we can also see, as if they were nearby on the shelf, books in other libraries on campus, and books in remote storage, and books that only exist digitally. Another thing we're doing right is surfacing more and more of our collection in our main discovery interface. So here are some ancient Greek papyrus fragments that are part of our collection. Physically, you can't browse these without getting special permission. So I think this is a clear example of enhancing the benefits of browsing by extending it to new areas of our collection. Below the papyri fragments, you see a collection of digitized medieval manuscripts from the Walters Art Museum. These are physically housed in the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore, Maryland, so they would not otherwise be easily browsed by researchers in California. And you can not only see the metadata about the manuscripts, you can actually read them. Here's a detailed view of one of the books. Again, this is a huge step in the right direction. Digitized collections give us more flexibility than ever in acquiring or pointing to digital versions of items our researchers want. And we're starting to bring some of these advances into archival collections too. This is SALT, the Self-Archiving Legacy Toolkit. This is an archival collection that we're using Blacklight to browse, and we've also used entity extraction to identify the names, places, and organizations mentioned in the collection. I think this kind of semi-automated metadata creation is going to get better and better as machine learning develops and becomes easier to use as a technique. I think historians and archival researchers in particular are going to benefit from better browsing access, especially since more and more archives are in digital form from the beginning. For example, here's an item from the Stephen Jay Gould papers, but it isn't a paper, it's a floppy disk. The notion of physical browse access for this collection breaks down entirely. So getting it online and providing any kind of browse access to the files on those floppy disks is another clear example of enhancing the benefits of browsing by extending it to new kinds of content. And finally, something I think we're doing very well is positioning ourselves to allow for future innovation. We are building robust infrastructure for our collections. We are building local expertise in our staff. We are building our core software collaboratively. Here's our core software, by the way, if you'd like to check it out, including many other examples of great library, museum, and archive collections interfaces. But in spite of everything we're doing right, I still feel like something is missing. Partly it's that I really identify with those grad students I interviewed, who felt joy when browsing the stacks and sorrow when they lost the reading room full of paper journals. I think we're still falling short of a full replacement for physical browsing. I think we're still falling short of providing the kind of emotional, physical, and spatial sensory experience that shelf browsing at its best can provide. So this is where my talk gets a little wacky. If it's too far out there for you, just remember I had a head injury recently. And I live much more in my right brain than I used to. I think the solution will come to us if we keep watching the developments in humanities computing, 3D video games, and science fiction. So who's read this book, Rainbow's End? Oh, good, a good number of people. It won the Hugo Award in 2007. I think anyone who builds digital libraries should read this book. In one of the many subplots, UC San Diego has decided to digitize all of its books and remove access to physical volumes. So basically, Declan is the bad guy in this book. The way they go about doing this has some sci-fi elements, but it's ultimately not too different from our current situation, where many libraries are replacing physical access with digital access. This move to the digital realm is seen as a catastrophe by some of the university professors in the book, and hijinks ensue. But it's seen as an opportunity by the students, who mostly engage with the world via augmented reality and are excited to include the library in their augmented reality belief circles. I know, augmented reality. That's crazy futuristic, right? Until you realize that Google Glass was on the runway at the New York Fashion Week this year. So these students who use augmented reality are really excited about the library becoming digital because it means that they can use the library collections as if they're using the library at Hogwarts or Discworld or any of these other fantasy worlds that they choose to inhabit. And I adore this idea. I mean, first of all, these students are really excited about their university's digital library interface. This is my kind of escapist fantasy. But also because this seems kind of doable. We have an API that can give us a virtual shelf list now. We just need to render it in a 3D game engine. And actually, someone's already made a video game that includes the Unseen University Library from the Discworld books. This might be a little too ambitious for Hackfest next year, but we could at least have the conversation. Peter Binkley, I expect you to have something working. I would happily spend many hours exploring library collections in a beautiful virtual setting, and I don't think I'm alone in that. By tapping into video games, we could tap into spatial reasoning and memory, aesthetic pleasure, and all of the visceral reactions that the video game industry has put so much work into developing. Video games that focus on providing beautiful scenery and a feeling of tranquility are out there. Flow and Flower are two that come to mind. And I can't help but wonder what would happen if we could take something like Rose or the Orlando Project, these fascinating projects that are creating huge webs of linked data representing authors and works in the humanities, and plug that into an immersive 3D experience. So what's next? I would like for us, this community and Code for Lib and the librarians and the archivists and the museum curators, I would like for us all to go through this design process together. How might a digital library catalog make the user feel embodied? How might it allow for emotional responses? How might we browse for information with the powerful System 1 we evolved for exploring a landscape? Science fiction is full of compelling ideas about how libraries of the future might work. Humanities computing is full of fascinating explorations of information landscapes. And the worlds of 3D gaming, virtual reality, and augmented reality are becoming more sophisticated and powerful all the time. I don't yet know where we're going next, but I believe that if we keep having the conversation, if we keep having hackfests and access conferences and ideas that seem crazy at first, it's going to be somewhere very interesting. Thank you. So I think we have time for questions. Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense. One of the things that I would really love to see I really like the fact that our library catalog these days has a lot of artwork and archaeological specimens and all kinds of stuff that you wouldn't normally see on a library shelf, right? I would love to see curated exhibits that you can explore. That so like I showed you the classics papyri that we've brought in from the classics department. I think it would make a lot of sense to have maybe a room that you could go to, a virtual room that would have the library holdings, but also, some beautiful framed gallery photos up on the walls, or a shelf full of some of our archaeological items that you can interact with. I think you're making a very good point about keeping things on the human scale, and I think that by doing that, you do tap into all of this system one thinking that we do so effortlessly. Yeah, absolutely.
If I'm not mistaken, one of your slides was saying that faculty were highly interested in preserving this browsing ability.
Yeah.
Was that part of user studies that you did, or were these just informal conversations?
The first study I referenced was like a formal user study. I'm not sure you would even call it a user study because it was a research project that was coming out of the library school. So it was more about, it was more about me writing a thesis, honestly. But one of the things that came out of it, unprompted, was this idea that there had been a real loss there. And the study from the Stanford faculty was one that was commissioned by the library, but actually conducted by faculty members themselves, who were expressing a lot of concern that we were closing library branches and removing physical access to collections, and wanted to know, okay, you're taking something away from us. What are you going to give us in return? And how do we know that you're not going to take away from us something that we're never going to be able to get back?
Yeah. This was a fascinating presentation, and my mind is being a little bit rewired by it as well. And, as I explore linked data a little bit, I think, well, we can not only return to browse, but maybe we can do browse better, because it allows us to browse along an infinite number of dimensions, not just a single shelf, but to go in all of these different ways, like a big 3D kind of object. And I really like the idea of embodiment and physicality, and I think probably a lot of your System 1 impulses are based on that physical part of it, right? And I was wondering if you, or anyone, I guess, has ever seen a kind of a browse experiment that's like a whole body, where you can actually, manipulate an object or manipulate a representation of something in space to browse it in different ways? Because for me, like, something that would feel tactile like that would be really interesting, to be able to just kind of move a 3D object around, to look at it in different ways and follow new paths. So has anyone tried to do that?
Well, there's a ton of them. They're all about browsing library shelves. They're all about people physically in libraries who are exploring physical collections. Right. And the feedback that you get from those studies, it's where a lot of the serendipity research comes from. And what the thing, I've been really interested in the serendipity research for a long time. What the penny kind of dropped for me when I started realizing that serendipity isn't magic, right? It's actually pretty well tied to just our thinking process. So there have been a lot of studies on that. I haven't seen any studies about trying to recreate that experience in the virtual world. I think we're a little early days for that yet. I think it could be a really fruitful area for research. I did see at Open Repositories 2 years ago, they have something like Hackfest, but it's called the Developers Challenge. and they had someone with a Kinect there, and they were using the Kinect to physically move items around their digital repository and deposit something and, you know, bring it from over here and put it in the repository. And I thought that was really neat. I think that has a lot of possibility. Yeah.
I really like Erin McKean, the lexicographer, has a really great definition of serendipity that she mentions in her TED Talk. And she says that serendipity is finding things you weren't looking for because finding the things you were looking for is so damn difficult. One of the challenges that I've seen is I noticed in your browse displays that you're displaying electronic books as if they were on the shelf. And I think that's really fantastic. And that's what I would really like to see. You know, most OPACs now have a call number browse option that whenever I showed a user that, they were thrilled. And nobody knows about it. It's like this librarian secret tip, but when users find out about it, they really love it. But it's really common for people for libraries not to assign class marks to ebooks. Because it's really, I mean, it is really confusing for users to see a call number on something that's not a shelf mark that they're going to go and get, as opposed to a classification thing, which is the overloading that we've got. So we can't go back and reclassify and classify all these books that we've got in our collections now. So they're basically unbrowsable that way. So that's going to be a real barrier moving forward, even for something really simple, I think, right now.
Yeah, I think that's a shame. I think that call numbers are a secret, untapped resource that we could be doing much more with. Even if we can't assign, we have a lot of material that also has not had a call number assigned. But the great thing about copy cataloging is that often someone has assigned a call number to it, and sometimes we can get that anyway. One of the things that always frustrated me in my cataloging class back in library school was that you had to pick one thing that an item was about and assign a classification based on that thing. And one of the areas I feel like could be very interesting as we move more to digital browse is that there's no reason you can't shelve a book in two places. Call numbers, having things that are about the same thing co-located in a physical space is an incredibly powerful affordance, opportunity that we're offering to people. It has all kinds of possibilities built into it, and that are really fundamentally different from, I kind of know what I'm looking for already and I'm going to type it into a search box. Which is also, you know, another use case. I'm not saying get rid of that, but I do not want us to lose the rich experience of co-locating items, and call numbers are the best thing I've seen for doing that so far.
Thanks for the keynote. It was really wonderful. I just wanted to make a few comments. I agree with the distinction that you made between the browsing physical collection and then using e-resources, and how the emotional terms are usually associated with using physical collection compared to the efficiency of accessing online resources. But when I look back at my experience of doing research as a grad student, I think a lot of times that kind of experience is sort of like post-fact, romanticized version of what really happened. So I just wanted to mention that, because when I was actually doing that kind of research, I was really frustrated using this humongous library that is one of the best in the world, and it's spread out all throughout. Then you are looking at the OPAC, and then you go up the stacks, and it's amazing stacks, so which could have given me this immense immersing experience. I wouldn't say that it never happened, but I also remember a lot of times when I was just frustrated because I wanted to get to the source and have the pile of stuff that I need to read, and then I would just think about it. So often the state of flow happened really in front of my desk, looking at the the document rather than going up and down the stacks and the stairs of this great library. So there is that point that sometimes we romanticize what has happened later on when we have the online resources. So that's something to keep in mind. And secondly, I think there are a lot of things that libraries can do in terms of services. I was really interested to see the concept of flow show up in your presentation because I was looking into it in the context of gamification and how to apply the concept of gamification into the library services. Because often, a lot of times, our library services are sort of like hindrances. And in the case of online resources, how can you be in the state of flow if you have to enter the authentication, credentials into the proxy, and then you go into this website, that website, there is a basic barrier to the usability. So just by removing the obstacles, so for example, a lot of people tout the merit of having reference collections actually in the stacks around you rather than having it in the repository. But for me, having it delivered next day without me going through the stacks is the best thing in the world when I was doing the research. So there's definitely the counterpoint. And lastly, I wanted to make a comment about the immersive experience when you mentioned that you wanted to create that kind of experience and environment in the digital library. I think it would be doubly difficult because often in the digital environment, you're in front of a monitor. You are not in a quiet library building where usually you don't, we used to not have access to any other distraction, right? So the flow of, the state of flow is often made possible because you do not have other opportunity for distraction. So if you want to recreate that, you gotta think about the environment, not just what you can offer in terms of browsing or how comfortable or how fast, whatever it is. So there are factors that you have to consider, which is more responsible on the side of the subject rather than environment. So, using the sensory experience, for example, bringing sensory computing and that kind of stuff is often very successful to create this sort of flow state, because when you're using your body, you need the physical, you need concentration. So your mental state is almost automatically concentrated on the point that you cannot do anything else. So if you make maybe doing research in the digital library environment somewhat harder, maybe it's more immersive. I don't know. I just wanted to make a comment on that. I thought that might be useful.
Okay. As you were talking, it dawned on me that somebody who was a faculty member talking about how they missed browsing the library and the archives and all that has trained their System 1 for a very long time to be very good at that. Yep. And a teenager or someone in their 20s has no idea how to do that, has never done it in their life. They've spent their entire time that they can read browsing Reddit and 4chan and jumping around to things that seem completely inscrutable to slightly older people. So I think what we have is we're figuring out how to use our brains because our brains naturally try to throw everything, all the neurons they have at a certain problem. And if that problem seems to be browsing Reddit, then they get really, really good at that. And I think maybe those people coming up will build access to information in a way that they know how to do it. And our feeble attempts, speaking as, from the devil's advocate, techno-triumphalist TED Talk kind of point of view, is we're trying to take the old literate culture that is going away and bringing it into the online world, which might appear to younger people the same way that Homer memorizing the Odyssey is an interesting parlor trick, but not much use to them anymore. But that being said, we have a whole generation of people who deserve access to information into the future and who have the sum of human knowledge up to this point to contribute, and young people on their own, while they're very good at browsing Reddit, don't know anything. So I think it's incumbent on us now to ensure that the future is kind of evenly distributed and that we can help the people whose brains are totally wired in completely different ways to share information over a very narrow piece of bandwidth. So.
Thank you, Bess. I was struck by your statement of the challenge, which I'm completely down with. I think we're missing something big, and it's not the back of my big bald head. Hi. I'm particularly struck by what Bon-Hyun just said, and I was thinking along exactly the same lines. The minimal training I've had in cognitive psychology oriented me to think very deeply about the natural world and its relationship with how we've evolved and how we process information. And that leaves me skeptical, I think as Bo-Hyun said she was as well, to believe that we can find a solution that will satisfy your dissatisfaction that involves individuals staring at glowing entertainment rectangles. And instead, I think what you were saying earlier about community and its relation to physical space and the natural environment will be the three things we need to have tied in together before we get that answer that feels right. And the computing environment will support that and reflect that and maybe lead us back to it. But I hope that in 2033, when we're celebrating the 40th Access, you can give another keynote and reflect on how well we've done between now and then.
Okay.
And maybe we can work on it between then.
Okay.
These are great comments, and I really enjoyed the talk, and I like the idea where your thoughts lead to. I mean, as far as the tools we're developing, and I think that's great stuff. And just a couple of comments, and maybe if you want to react to them, is one thing I've noticed is, as I've gone from institution to institution in my career, is that that faculty, particularly faculty attitudes towards some of these questions, scale or track with the collection richness or the collection paucity of the institution, and that you've been at UVA, you've been at Stanford, some of us have been at other places with big collections too, and so people are really keenly into the browsing notion. But as you go to the collection poor places, they sort of surrender those notions and accept other things and train other parts of their brain to do things. And Alexander sort of took some of the steam out of my sails with the second one, which is that there's a generational issue here. And so those graduate students you interviewed for a paper in 2007, let's see, it was probably 2005 when you were 6 when you interviewed them. They were born in the early, mid-'80s. They're different than my children or anyone else in here who's got young kids. And I see my kids, ironically, they can do both things. They can actually browse quite well in a physical space, but they can also, they don't seem to draw any distinction, and that's kind of frightening for me as an adult, that they don't seem to care whether they go to the library in the corner or pick up an iPad and use Audible. They just don't seem to care. And I thought maybe the suggestion here is that, and for myself and for anyone, is that when we're doing focus groups in the library, I'm kind of tired of talking to gray-haired faculty, including myself. You know, my attitudes are completely and utterly fossilized. We should really just bring in a bunch of 8-year-olds and sit them down in a room and look at how they use information. And if we develop around what they're doing, we're going to win huge, I think.
Speaking of cognitive psychology, I came across a book, serendipitously, to be honest, very recently called The Invisible Gorilla by a couple of psychologists I no longer remember. But in it, they talk about 6 things. And if you memorize these 6 things when you're looking for stuff, and you realize the box of limitation that they put you in, you'll be able to create your own serendipitous encounters, essentially. And the 6 things are the illusion, they call them illusions, because really they give you that tunnel vision, right? The illusion of attention is one, and the illusion of memory is another. Memory isn't exact. The experience is long since gone, and then unless it has that emotional context, it's difficult to remember correctly. So the third one is knowledge. What you think you know or what you believe you understand is in there as well. The illusion of cause gives motivation for people and that kind of thing. The illusion of potential. Some people think they're really up there and they're not, and some people put themselves really down and when they're actually better than they think. And the final one is the illusion of confidence. So there you go. If you recognize the box that these put you in, you can discover things serendipitously.
Any other
else?
questions? Thank you, Bess. Big round for Bess, please.